People come to philosophy because they want to really challenge their views. Philosophy is all about challenging our fundamental assumptions about the world and trying to get clearer about the nature of the world and our predicament. And what you get in Hume is someone who really seems to come to the whole framework afresh and is willing in a quite intellectually bold and courageous way to question things and challenge our views. And there's a kind of integrity to his philosophy. Hume's rigor is not only in the precision of his thought, but also in the accessibility and lucidity of the way he presents it. He's a great stylist. He is a kind of model of intellectual, philosophical ambition and lucidity. You have to go back to the ancients, I think, to find somebody who lives up to those standards that we should all be following, of really being willing to have open, critical conversation, because that's what philosophy is about. Hume is really a solidly 18th century thinker. He was born in 1711 and he died in 1776. So that positions him right through in the 18th century. He was born just as the Enlightenment starts to hit full steam, so he's at the receiving end of that momentum. His family was minor aristocrats, so his family was well connected, but his father died when Hume was very young, so he's brought up by his mother. He had a brother and a sister. He was educated at Edinburgh University. University education then, students were much younger, really more sort of high school age, so he was at University of Edinburgh in the 1720s, roughly when he was about 12 or 13 to about 15 or 16. Edinburgh University was a very kind of dynamic environment at that time. Intellectually, it was itself really the Enlightenment spirit was at full steam at Edinburgh University, so it was a very good time for a young, very talented person like Hume to be getting educated. Once he graduated, he was still obviously in his teens, and his family had a tradition and established in law, so there was the thought that he'd go into law. But Hume really never got that excited about it. He always had a strong interest in the classics, the ancients, and it became clear that philosophy was really where his talent and his interests were. And by the 1730s, you know, when he was still very young, he is really a philosophical prodigy. He was well into thinking about one of his greatest, most ambitious work, the treatise of human nature, was getting planned out. And he had a kind of, interestingly, when he was about 18 or 19, he had an intellectual crisis, a sort of mental crisis, in the way that one or two other famous philosophers like John Stuart Mill did. And for various reasons, in 1734, he was back down in the borders area of Scotland, near Berwick, south of Edinburgh, between Edinburgh and Newcastle. And that's where his family home was. He actually had some family friends, a mentor, Lord Kames, who was himself a significant figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, who was really a father figure for Hume, who was influencing him. And so that was part of his kind of intellectual milieu at that time as he was thinking about the treatise. And he left in 1734 for various reasons. I have particular biographical reasons that I might come back to later why he left, but he went briefly to Bristol to get a career down there with a merchant, and then he went to France, and he was in Paris and La Flèche, where Descartes had been a student and had done his own work. And essentially the treatise got finalized there, and he came back to London about 1737, prepared it for publication, and so the treatise was published. Treatise of Human Nature was published in 1739. It actually came in 3 books. There were 3 separate volumes. So in 1739, early 1739, when Hume was still disconcertingly young, just 28, the treatise was in print, the first 2 volumes. There was then an almost 2-year gap, and the 3rd volume on morals. The first 2 books was first on understanding, second on passions. That appeared in 1739. Late 1740, by this time Hume was back up in Scotland, the 3rd volume on morals had appeared. And famously, Hume was all excited about what he thought, how the reception of the treatise would go. He described it in his brief autobiography at the end of his life. It fell deadborn from the press. And he was disappointed in its reception. Its reception is an interesting story itself. But he was incredibly kind of energetic and resilient. He came right back up, and in Scotland, when he was based up at his family home again, he started writing essays and working on other things. He had various jobs as a tutor at this time. Again, he famously applied for a chair at Edinburgh University in 1745, and then I speak as an Edinburgh graduate here, they rejected him, much to their disgrace and regret, I'm sure. And then Hume had various jobs and positions as he kept actively involved in his philosophical and other projects. The major ones that came in terms of his publications, in 1748 he wrote the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, published the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which is really, it would be slightly unfair to say, but it's primarily a reworked version of Book 1 of the Treatise on the Understanding, focused on issues of understanding and metaphysics. And then in 1751, he published the second inquiry, the Inquiry Concerning the Principle of Morals, which was mainly the moral work that was in the third volume of the treatise. He felt the treatise had failed famously more for the manner than the matter, so there's some debate about how that relationship should be understood, which is interesting, but essentially there's a lot of reworked material represented. The other publications that came after that is in the 1750s he got a job as the librarian in the Advocates Library at Edinburgh University, the law library, and that gave him access to a fantastic library, and he wrote his History of England. And ironically, his early reputation in the 18th century was based primarily on the success of his History of England, and that appeared in the 1750s. And then he carried on with various, he was always writing essays, adding to his essays. He wrote four dissertations that appeared in 1757. Probably the most famous or infamous was his natural history of religion. So he's contributing to these kinds of things. And then after that, he had various jobs, essentially diplomatic jobs. He was the secretary to the ambassador in Paris, the British ambassador in Paris in the 1760s. This gave him contact with leading figures of the French Enlightenment, so he was very close to these figures like Baron de Holbach, Diderot, Voltaire, these people. He had contacts with D'Alembert. He then returned to Britain. He famously had a contact with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who he tried to help, one of the sort of little scandals of philosophy, and he and Rousseau fell out, mainly because of Rousseau's quite bizarre paranoid personality. And Hume, who was famously a very gentle and mild and easy guy, nevertheless defended himself fairly vigorously against Rousseau's bizarre accusations of trying to make him humiliate him. And then he returned eventually in the late 1760s to Scotland, where he had many, many very good friends. And again, in terms of the Enlightenment credentials, Adam Smith, Scottish philosopher, and now seen as a great economist and economic thinker through The Wealth of Nations, was a very close friend of Hume's. And there were, of course, many distinguished people still at work in Edinburgh, and he was close to them. He got unwell by the time he was around in his early 60s. It turned out to be something like bowel cancer or something of that intestinal sort. And he died in 1776. He had written and was working on the dialogues concerning natural religion for really 2 or 3 decades. But he had never published it because there were problems about publishing a work that was so obviously irreligious or had anti-Christian content. And he actually asked Adam Smith to publish it, and Smith, although a very good friend and admirer, was reluctant to do that because he thought it would create problems, and it was Hume's nephew who published that in 1779 posthumously. So that's really positions Hume as really at the mainstream of the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, and really in contact with the major figures, not just in Scotland, but in England and in France. So he was very well connected intellectually, politically, socially, in all these ways, and he had a finger in many of those pies. the treatise of human nature, his first work, his most ambitious work, both in scale and scope, detail, is usually regarded as his most interesting and important work. Which is not to say that the other works aren't themselves very significant and even have very important independent material that's quite distinct and arguments that are different from the treatise or reinterpret or advance the arguments in the treatise. But the treatise nevertheless is the great ambitious work, and I think that's been widely accepted and still widely accepted. But at the same time, the view has been that Hume also is one of the great thinkers on the subject of religion, and in particular he's a great irreligious, or if you want, anti-Christian thinker, although that itself is a matter of debate, exactly how to interpret that and exactly what his commitments were or were not. How irreligious was he or wasn't he? But the view has been, and it has been seen as a kind of neo-orthodoxy, that although the treatise might have early on had some irreligious elements in it, that they were all removed, or as Hume said in a letter that's often quoted, that he castrated the treatise and took off its noblest parts, namely the parts that had irreligion. And the parts he was talking about were primarily about miracles, although there's some debate about exactly what was or was not being included in that. And so it's been, for a very long time, thought that the treatise really wasn't about religion at all, although he eventually applied the major skeptical and naturalistic themes that appear in the treatise to religion in his later work. Later on in the first inquiry, the inquiry concerning human understanding, where miracles get reintroduced, where there's a discussion of the argument from design and so on and so forth. And then primarily in the posthumously published dialogues where he directly addresses the problem of the existence of God. But the irony about this is his greatest work doesn't seem to, on that account, have any connection with one of his greatest contributions about religion. And one of the things that I've been working on and trying to rethink in terms of understanding Hume's philosophy is that, in fact, this has generated a serious problem for understanding Hume's original project in the treatise. And on the original assumption, the treatise had two major themes. Hume is usually seen on this account as part of the great triumvirate of British empiricists. So there's Locke, Berkeley, Hume. And Hume is kind of bringing up, he's the back-end hitter, as it were, who's sort of elaborating on the themes that Locke and Berkeley got going in the empiricist tradition. And on this early kind of skeptical tradition, which got some support from some of Hume's early Scottish critics, in particular a very eminent Scottish thinker who Hume knew personally a little bit, Thomas Reid, interpreted Hume as a kind of radical skeptic. And so the idea here was that Hume was following up on the foundations of empiricist thought, namely the idea that human understanding and human thought and reasoning in the final analysis depends on our sense experience, and it's limited to that. And that reason itself has to operate on the materials that are given through sense experience. And that we have to understand all our fundamental commonsensical commitments about the nature of the world, the nature of the mind, nature of causation, and so on and so forth in these terms. And Hume, on this account, is seen as showing that if we have these empiricist, non-rationalist starting points, we end up in deep skeptical problems where we undermine common sense beliefs in things like, how do we know there's an external material world? How do we know there are other minds, or even what my own mind is? Free will. And it applies all the way through into things like moral distinctions, and it's seen as systematically, destructively skeptical, undermining our confidence in knowledge of the world and knowledge of morality and things of that sort. And this view really dominated right through the 19th century. And in fact, some of Hume's early 19th century editors confidently said the only people he ever read were Locke and Berkeley. And he had almost no interest in anyone else. There was a very important work by Norman Kemp Smith, a Scottish scholar in the 20th century. Actually, he also was based at Princeton before he went back to become himself a professor at Edinburgh. And he wrote some articles and then finally a book, Philosophy of David Hume, that really challenged that skeptical interpretation and gave what he called a naturalistic interpretation. And the naturalistic interpretation that Kemp Smith gave really has two parts. Naturalism is a bit of all these terms are slippery and potentially problematic, but naturalism roughly is the idea that there was a positive agenda, not just a negative skeptical agenda. And the positive agenda had to do with the science of human nature. And in particular, Hume, on Kemp Smith's account, Hume was first interested in morality. And the person, according to Kemp Smith, who influenced it wasn't so much Locke and Berkeley per se. It was Francis Hutchinson, who was a great predecessor of in Scotland in the early 18th century, professor at Glasgow, when Hume was still a young student. And Hume applied the moral sense philosophy of Hutchinson, which emphasized feeling over reason, and applied this theme back to metaphysical and epistemological problems, insisting that when we understand our psychology and the importance of feeling in human life, we see the limits of reason, and some of the skeptical problems fade away because it's feeling that fills the gap that reason can't really provide the secure foundations for. So you get this kind of, the naturalist theme on this account is a split between the importance of feeling over reason, which is a kind of Enlightenment theme in general. It's kind of irony, because the Enlightenment is caught up with the idea of the importance of reason, but there are also this theme that you get from Hume and others about the limits of reason. Reason, as it were, operating on itself. And in particular, what you get is, has become very important in the 20th century, late 20th century, and is still very important in the influence and legacy of Hume, is the idea of the Newton of the moral sciences. Newton was the great scientific thinker in the natural sciences. On this account, Hume was supposed to be the Newton of the moral sciences. The treatise was this ambition to apply the experimental method to human psychology, human mind, and do for that what Newton had done for the natural sciences. But the problem with this is that those two parts don't fit together, because the skeptical arguments are still there. And there are radical or extreme skeptical arguments that seem to undermine all science and all claims, because they show that on this account that all scientific reasoning is in fact groundless and subject to skeptical arguments. We can't be confident in any of our claims. But at the same time, he's supposedly advancing a Newtonian program. So it's not just that they seem disconnected, they seem actually directly in conflict, and so the whole project looks broken-backed. Well, I call that the riddle of the treatise. It's really, how do we put this back together again? Because the problem is that they both genuinely seem to be major themes that are there. One way some scholars have tried to solve this problem is by kind of willing the other side away or closing their eyes to it. But they're there, and the question is, how do they really fit together? So the proposal I've made, and I think is really one, it relates as well to issues about understanding humanist context and completely rethinking the Locke-Berkeley line and the Hutchinson-Newton line and all of that, rethinking this whole period. But you can really describe this independently of the historical aspect of it. The truth is that when you start to realize that what Hume, it's just false, that Hume was not interested in religion from the very beginning. And religion never was far away from what Hume had right at the forefront of his mind, and in fact is the deep motivation behind the whole project. So on the account I want to provide, the way to solve or address this riddle is to explain that both the skepticism and the naturalism are part of a deeper irreligious motivation. And roughly the idea is this. The skepticism is about pursuing a theme that had been pursued by other great thinkers of the Enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, and Pierre Bayle, people of that sort, who wanted to separate philosophy from religion, to put it sharply. That philosophy was abused and misused when it was used to support superstitious doctrine and dogma. And so the skepticism in Hume is roughly what brings all these arguments together that look like they're, on the other accounts, just a kind of scrambled, disconnected set of arguments about causation, induction, the external world, space and time. They're all carefully, on the interpretation, irreligious interpretation, motivated by an effort to undermine and discredit systems of theological metaphysics and ethics. So that's what holds the skepticism together. On the naturalistic side, as it were, what Hume proposes is, although there are radical skeptical arguments, Hume uses those radical skeptical arguments to show the limits of reason. But in the same way, he keeps that moderated as it were, between an extreme and a more moderate skepticism that allows him to pursue a science of human nature or the science of man. And the idea there is it's not just a kind of science of man per se, but the idea is to create a scientific secular ethics, an ethics that itself doesn't depend on religion or religious metaphysics and doctrine. So if you follow, the two are intimately connected, and in fact, from my point of view, the catastrophic mistake is to try and see Hume as not being interested in religion, because then you never see how these parts are integrated in fact, a coherent whole and unify the whole project, which is actually deeply related to Hume's own debts to thinkers such as Hobbes and Spinoza and others. The way I came to this understanding of Hume is, like everybody else, I had been, and I think for better or worse still, I've been educated in the old British empiricist versus continental rationalist with Immanuel Kant, the great German Enlightenment thinker, as the great synthesizer, bringing them together. And I'd grown up and been educated at Edinburgh, among other places, ironically enough, in the David Hume Tower, well educated by very able, distinguished Hume scholars themselves. But I'd grown up with this view. And I actually was interested in issues of free will that related to Hume, because Hume made great contributions on this topic of free will, liberty, and necessity himself, and I was working in that area. And by this time, actually, I was down in Cambridge as a graduate student, and I was looking through some books of Hobbes, because Hobbes also had some similar views on liberty and necessity. And it was really a kind of epiphany moment. I came across a passage in Hobbes. There was a reworked version of his Elements of Law, which was published early on, and the title, ironically, was A Treatise of Human Nature. I tweaked a little bit. I thought, gosh, that's a funny coincidence. And then I was reading what Hobbes describing his own work in this slightly amended, edited, reworked form, A Treatise of Human Nature, which had been published in 1650, almost a century before Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. And I thought, gosh, the plan of Hobbes, and Hobbes described his plan, is exactly the plan of Hume's treatise, with the same title. So I had this moment where I thought, gosh, that's really quite striking. And Hobbes, of course, is someone who should be right off the map in terms of Hume's debts and who Hume was thinking or tracking. Because Hobbes is an awkward figure. There are empiricist elements to his thought about the origins of human thought and understanding, but he also has a very kind of rationalistic, geometric conception of scientific methodology, which seemed very alien to Hume's experimental method, more to the kind of Newtonian paradigm. And so my kind of earliest work on this was I started thinking about Hobbes, and then I published something on this and said that, there's quite striking. And in fact, I had noticed that another very distinguished scholar, a man called D.D. Raphael, had noticed the similarity of the titles. He was one person who had noticed this and commented on it, so it wasn't absolutely on my own in that, which I found reassuring because I was quite young at the time. And then I started thinking about the influence of Hobbes, and I started reading about Hobbes, and there was quite a bit of interesting material about Hobbes' influence, but it all stopped at the end of the 17th century. And it sort of seemed to just peter out. And Hobbes' reputation was that, above all, as being an atheist. So when I started looking at this project, I started thinking it in terms of that, and the next kind of step was that Hobbes' great critic was a man called Samuel Clark, who was a very good friend of Isaac Newton's. And Samuel Clark is a figure who's sort of been lost sight of by this period, by the early 21st, late 20th century. But Clark was an immensely important and immensely able figure. He actually represented Newton intellectually in his intellectual battles, very important intellectual battles with Leibniz, the great German philosopher. So this is not a negligible figure. And Clark had published, he had actually given a series of Boyle lectures, which were hugely important. They'd been founded by Robert Boyle, the great English scientist and philosopher, and they were dedicated to the refutation of atheism, and particularly the figures who were linked together under that were, interestingly, Hobbes and Spinoza. We don't link those figures. We don't now. The established view doesn't link them. But to the 18th century, these were the dominant people. It would be like Marx and Lenin. So I suddenly started thinking, and I realized that Hume was systematically criticizing Clark's philosophy and religious philosophy in general. There's a whole school connected with them. Now, both camps, both if you want, the irreligious camp and the religious philosophers, what Hume himself describes as the split between religious philosophers and speculative atheists. They're quite diverse, but they were recognized different camps in the early 18th century context, and this is right mainstream to what Hume was doing. So the irony about this is, in relation to the way I worked myself into this, it was actually through thinking about the structural plan, what the significance of it was. And this started to peel together. And then what I realized, it was a bit like in Aladdin's cave, is I started realizing that each of the components of the treatise, which seemed to be totally disconnected, were actually quite well fused and focused together with this underlying unity and program, which made, of course, far more sense of the historical context, which, in my view, the other theories don't make sense of at all. So instead of having a disjointed, fragmented project, it suddenly, not only philosophically, but historically, all started to make sense. And sometimes it was a bit like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. You knew what the fundamental picture was like, and I felt kind of lucky that way, because there's always a little bit of luck in that. And I could see that, but sometimes I had puzzle cases where I think, how does this work? And it was a bit like cracking a code. And so this went right down to very small things, like figuring out, Hume has epigrams on the title pages of his treatise. And I suddenly realized that the epigrams were highly significant. One of them comes straight from Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico Politicus, which is a hugely influential work, very religious work, arguing against miracles, arguing for the separation of philosophy and theology, arguing above all for freedom of thought. So to Hume's contemporaries in the 18th century, this was kind of a red-hot atheism. Most of them would not miss this at all. Sadly, it had been lost sight of for a very long time, but this all started to make sense. So there are a lot of components like that, and then gradually the whole thing in bits and pieces. So you can actually see the irreligious interpretation in its sort of small components by rethinking each part, causation, induction, external world. But you can also see that it is all fitting together and having these deep roots and rethinking the Enlightenment itself and Hume's place in the Enlightenment. There's a relationship between philosophy and religion and morality. You take that as a triangle. And you might see the religious philosophers as taking these kind of fundamental views, which is religion needs and is susceptible to rational support from philosophy. If you want, that's kind of fundamental defense of the theological project. To defend the use of philosophy in support of religion, and you can make religion reasonable and justify it. A second component to that, related to that, is that morality needs religion to ground it. You can't have morality without religion. We need belief in God. We need belief in the immortality of the soul in the future state. We need religion and religious metaphysics, confidence in the scripture, and so on and so forth, all of which can be given rational support through philosophy and philosophical reflection. And so you can't have, as it were, an autonomous relationship between philosophy and morality where it's cut off from religion. If you want, that's the negative side of their project. Whereas what I take Hume and the people he's following, like Hobbes and Spinoza, are arguing exactly the opposite. The crucial struts of their philosophy. It's not about empiricism versus rationalism. I don't think that's really how Hume would see himself or his contemporaries saw him. That's our project, our concern, and it relates to and is integrated with what they were discussing. But it doesn't capture how they really are motivated or even capture how their own philosophies, Hume's philosophy in particular, is put together. What captures that is Hume's effort to show that philosophy does not support religion. In fact, on the contrary, philosophical reflection discredits and undermines religion in a systematic and fairly radical way. Religion doesn't need to support, or more to the point, morality doesn't need the support of religion at all. And the positive, constructive part is to show how you can ground morality on a philosophically, scientifically rigorous account of human nature and the way we operate. You don't need religion to support morality. So as it were, those are the struts that really motivate and hold together the treatise, and the treatise in some sense lays the foundation for Hume's subsequent thinking all the way through. It's a development and elaboration of what he's doing. And I would see Hume's thought in that way. I would just be tempted to say that there's a kind of myth about British empiricism. The deep irony about this is not only should Hume not be linked, as it were, with Locke and Berkeley, they're on the other side of what's really motivating him. They are both Christian thinkers trying to defend Christian theology and Christian morality. And they are trying to refute atheistic thinkers. Hume is actually, although there are overlapping materials, and he often draws from their materials to support his own position, his motivation, his fundamental commitments are exactly on the other side of the fence. So Berkeley, for example, makes very clear that he's attacking skeptics and atheists, and he has Hobbes and Spinoza primarily in mind. If the interpretation is right, then although Hume has aspects of Berkeley's philosophy that he incorporates into his irreligious scheme, they're done with the opposite intention of Berkeley, which is Berkeley wanted to refute atheism and skepticism. Hume uses it to support atheism and skepticism and discredit the kind of theological picture that Berkeley, as an Anglican priest, wanted to support. When Hume was writing the treatise, one of the interesting things that I think has been lost, that contributed a little bit to supporting the irreligious interpretation, because I started thinking about what the significance of all of this was, and I started to look at what Hume was doing when he was a young man, really philosophical prodigy, working on the treatise, in terms of the significance of these basic structures, the Hobbes program, the atheistic work. And I started looking at Hume's early biography, and there's a very influential biography of Hume by Ernest Mosner, which is full of interesting stuff, and it's a great contribution. And people cite it religiously. It's not too ironic. But like all works, it's got its own limitations and gaps. And what I found is that there was a period, perhaps the most important period of Hume's life, was the period when he was actually working on the basic plan and project of the treatise, late 1720s, early 1730s, when he's a young man, himself about 20 years old or so. And he was based down in the Borders area, in Churnside, where his family home was. And one of the things that was lost sight of is the kind of fascinating little mini debate that went on with very distinguished people who are now minor people in intellectual history, but at the time were very able people. One of them was Lord Kames, or then Henry Hume, who was Hume's family member, who I mentioned as a kind of mentor figure, father figure for Hume, who was a philosopher himself, had been debating and corresponding with Samuel Clark about Clark's philosophy and his proofs for the dogmatic proofs for the existence of God. He had also had contact with Joseph Butler, a very distinguished Anglican theologian and philosopher. Kames, Henry Hume, had himself a debate with another man called Andrew Baxter, who was probably Scotland's most important, in fact, he was probably the most important defender of Samuel Clark's philosophy in Britain, maybe anywhere at the time, and had in 1733, that's to say just before Hume left to go and work in France on the treatise, had published a book called The Inquiry into the Human Soul, which was a defense of Clark's philosophy against atheistic thinkers like Hobbes and Spinoza. And there had been a fairly belligerent exchange between Henry Hume, Hume's mentor, and Andrew Baxter. And there had been a third figure in there who's a very interesting and bizarre figure in a way, a tenant farmer. This is very much Scottish 18th century social climate, pretty well self-educated, who was something of a radical free thinker. And Baxter had been prosecuting, because Baxter was he was a funny figure. In some sense, he was a liberal, advanced, progressive thinker in terms of his Clarkian Newtonian philosophy. But he was also deeply hostile to atheistic thought. And he thought that Dudgeon was promoting atheistic philosophy of a kind of Hobbes, Spinoza's kind. And there was a church prosecution at Churnside where Hume was a young man growing up. And bizarrely, the minister at Churnside was Hume's uncle. His mother's brother was the minister prosecuting this radical freethinker Dudgeon, who was pursued by this man, Andrew Baxter. So there's this connection that goes very deep into Hume's early biography, that when we talk about these figures, we tend to talk about them in terms of Newton and Hobbes and Spinoza and these large people removed. But when you look at the detail of Hume's biography, this debate between religious philosophers and speculative atheists came right to the doorstep of his home, his own intimate friends and relations, his uncle. My own speculation is that very, very possibly the reason he left in 1734 was that's just when the prosecution of Dudgeon was going on. And Dudgeon and Hume Hume was going on to say things very like Dudgeon, the sort of stuff that got Dudgeon into a church prosecution. So these aspects are very fundamental to understanding Hume's thought, and they have been completely lost. So part of the irreligious interpretation is to try to bring back this historical biographical detail, because it makes a great deal of sense of what Hume was actually up to and why he was up to these things. The irony about this is that one old picture has been that the people who were really after Hume were the backward old-style Calvinists, and that Hume was more connected with the liberal progressive group. But the truth is much more complicated and messy about Scottish religious and philosophical history and dynamics at the time. In the period when he was actually working on the treatise in the 1730s and 40s, the old Calvinists were very hostile to what they saw as latitudinarian progressive views about natural religion, Newtonian religion coming up from England and other places and sort of polluting their old style faith over reason Calvinism. But the then progressives, who had really been liberal figures behind the Enlightenment, and this might include people like Francis Hutchinson himself, who's often referred to, I think somewhat misleadingly, but referred to as the father of the Scottish Enlightenment, was actually quite hostile to this sort of radical, more radical views, if you want, the radical Enlightenment views of people like Hume. And they were themselves quite intolerant, ironically. I sometimes use the model here of something like political debate, where you have maybe conservatives and social democrats are fighting it out. But the social democrats end up being incredibly hostile to what they see as the really radical, crazy Marxist-Leninists. And sometimes the internal hostilities there are even stronger. So it's a more messy situation. It was true that as the church progressed and the church liberalized in Scotland in the 1740s and 50s, there was another more liberal group that, again, who were more accepting of Hume within the kind of church framework. And they were split from, if you want, the more moderate party. But that was really the party that Hume was dealing with when he was writing the treatise. And they were very hostile to atheistic philosophy of the sort that Hume and others were putting forward. It's a really interesting question about Hume's legacy and what's happened to Hume's thought since he published his work and after his death. And it's true of any thinker. A legacy is really, it ceases to be in control of the author, because it's what other people do with your thought that changes it, and it's always interconnected with subsequent interests, subsequent needs, and what a particular thinker might project as the value and interest of his or her work can be fundamentally changed and altered over time. And Hume's legacy, I think, is a bit like that. And the other aspect of it that makes it complicated is not just that throughout the 19th and 20th century people did things with it that reflected their interests and the input of other great thinkers. Most importantly, in the case of Hume, the impact of Kant and Kantian's philosophy changed the kind of philosophical agenda. I would say in that case the agenda changed to seeing philosophy very deeply in terms of not so much the relationship between philosophy and religion and morality, but primarily philosophy's role was concerned with the relationship between philosophy and science. So the big problem became, if you want, fundamentally the big epistemological problem that Kant poses in the Critique of Pure Reason. How can we have any knowledge of the world? How is objective knowledge possible? What are the conditions of that? What role does experience versus a priori concepts play? And that changed the whole way in which people looked at Hume's philosophy and tried to fit it in for reasons that I've explained, I think, are somewhat problematic. But certainly Hume's legacy then became part of the empiricist tradition, and that worked its way through people like John Stuart Mill. Part of that was ethical, to adapt Hume's ethical thought, which had a utilitarian component, but in its own way somewhat misrepresents what Hume is about. And right into the 20th century, that became, in the side of ethics, it became an emphasis on feeling and the limits of reason that in its most kind of extreme and radical form took the kind of logical positivist view about an emotivist theory of ethics, that really we just kind of, as it were, evince our feelings. And there was, in my view, a kind of fairly radical distortion of Hume's own position, a kind of simplification of it, as well as a missing out on what Hume actually thought his own importance and significance could and should be. But the difficulty is that you've got the actual real legacy that's been worked out over the last 2 centuries, since 2.5 centuries, since Hume's death. And I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that Hume certainly, the influence has been in understanding the importance of the relationship between philosophy and science, and the big debate about understanding what role the human understanding plays, and how reason is governed how reason is governed and shaped in creating those foundations. The kinds of challenges, and this is somewhat the relationship between the skeptical naturalistic dichotomy. One of the aspects of Hume that becomes very interesting is what roles justifications play, what kinds of justifications we're looking for, whether we can, as it were, defeat skeptical challenges. This is the traditional view that's worked its way through, and these have set the, if you want, certainly the academic agenda right through the 20th century. And there is certainly a tradition of empiricist theory of science that is deeply influenced by Hume, and that is massively influential in 20th and even right into 21st century philosophy. There's also just generally the theory of mind, how the mind works and operates, and this now has engaged people with an interest in the relevance of Hume's thought for contemporary cognitive science and naturalistic understanding of the mind, not looking for any kind of transcendental, non-natural entities, any spooky metaphysics, but making sense of the mind in these scientific terms. All of that is very much part of the general Humean program, and people feel Hume is a model for that and turn to him, and it's inspired them. But I suppose from my point of view, there's always the engagement of a legacy is always engaging with the reinterpretation or critical interpretation of the works as you go on. And just as our own philosophical interests and inputs are constantly changing, it's a healthy thing. This is the role of the historian of philosophy, to be always rethinking and questioning the interpretation from for the reasons we've been discussing about the irreligious interpretation, challenging those interpretations and asking if we've got it right. And if I'm correct, and the irreligious interpretation is the more accurate and more faithful to Hume's fundamental aims and ambitions, then I would like to think that in the long run there's something philosophically substantial to get from Hume that's been lost because of really failing to interpret the work accurately. And here I think that really Hume has a very big worldview. It's presented primarily and particularly in the treatise of human nature, but it works throughout his thought, which is it's all held together about the importance of, on one side, the program of secular scientific morality, freeing morality from the, as Hume saw it, the corruptions and distortions of superstition, protecting philosophy from the corruptions and distortions of superstition, and seeing religion in a critical light which mitigates, as Hume saw it, and people who are on board with that irreligious program will see it, the kind of dangerous influences of religion, but trying to understand religion in these naturalistic terms. So for me, getting that focus back should change the legacy, and changing the interpretation, I hope it will change the legacy and show that it integrates with things that should be matters of fundamental concern to us. So I think the legacy is always being contested. It's always being adapted to our own interests and our own perspectives, but it sort of integrates with debates about interpretation and the significance of the text itself.